Good evening. Got this beautiful sun going down. Let me see if I can read us a little bit from chapter 17. Iron Ladies. The Iron Lady of the Western world? Me? A cold warrior? Well, yes, if that is how they wish to interpret my defense of values and freedoms fundamental to our way of life. Margaret Thatcher, 1976. When Queen Boadicea, courtesy of the sculptor Thornycroft, did finally take up her position upon the Thames embankment in 1902, it was an embodiment of the age of empire, lest the message be missed. Cowper's proud lines of prophecy were inscribed upon the plinth. Regions Caesar never knew, thy posterity shall sway. Queen Victoria had died early in the previous year, the ripe age of 81. The role of the female ruler, provided it did not involve the actual battlefield, appeared to be conducive to longevity. In 1900, a very different kind of warrior queen, Cao Ci, the so-called Dragon Empress of China, had the impudence to solicit support from Queen Victoria during the Boxer Rebellion, which she herself had done much to foment on this very basis. Two old women, so ran her telegram, should understand each other's difficulties. Got a little side note here. It was not missed as late as the Second World War. Prime Minister Churchill's private secretary, John Colville, strolling through London in the Blitz to inspect landmarks he might not see again, described Boadicea's statue as a monument to successful imperialism. Okay, let me continue on 298 here. Born in 1835, an approximate contemporary of the Rani of Jhansi, the Dragon Empress was 16 years younger than Victoria. Nevertheless, even in 1902, the erection of the Boadician monument should still be seen as celebrating a kind of maternal imperialism indistinguishable to its practitioners from patriotism, personified by Victoria herself. Curiously enough, the embankment site was a second, or if one remembers Prince Albert's original suggestion of the Hyde Park Arch nearly half a century before, a third choice. Thornycroft's projects had passed through various vicissitudes following the prince's premature death in 1861. To be sure, there was a melancholy bonus and a series of equestrian portraits of his former patron, but Thornycroft had toiled on the Boadician group for 15 years before a favorable review of it in The Times in 1871 suggested the possibility of a government commission. The sculptor resumed work in 1883, but died 2 years later, at which point his family offered the group to the public, together with a contribution to the heavy cost of casting. It was a spurt of interest in the supposed burial place of Boadicea near the end of the century, which was responsible for the final step. the London County Council proposed to erect the statue at the top of Parliament Fields on the grounds that a tumulus there was the traditional site. A subscription of L2 800 was raised to have Thornycroft's statue cast in bronze, with a further 1,500, probably pounds, for a pedestal by J.G. Jackson. Intervention from the Society of Antiquaries, who rejected the Parliament Fields tradition, left the Boadicean group once more sightless until 1902, when it reached its present resting place near Westminster Bridge and within sight of the Houses of Parliament. Beyond Cowper's significant lines, the inscription beneath the statue kept various other options open. The subject of the monument was described as Boadicea, Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, who died AD 61 after leading her people against the Roman invader. Boadicea's daughters, however, although shown as part of the group, 2 strapping females, bare-breasted as Amazons for the fight, suffered from their usual official disregard and were not named or even mentioned. As for the Iceni queen herself, her hair, in a neat page-boy style, rather than flowing, one really must admire her sang-froid, wrote Lord Edward Glicken in 1928 in a study of London's open-air statuary. For the horses, modeled, not too closely one hopes, on those of Prince Albert's stables, are galloping wildly, but Boadicea has no reins with which to control them, as she stands coolly aloft with her spear. This belief in the nobility of empire, attached to the idealized character of a patriotic woman, was to be one important element in the survival of the Boadician legend. The year 1900, for example, saw the publication of Britain's Greatness Foretold, story of Boadicea by Marie Trevelyan, which traced the foundations of our present freedom back to those ancient struggles against the Romans. The South African War against the Boers had begun while Marie Trevelyan was in the process of writing. The book is redolent with direct comparisons between Boadicea and Queen Victoria. Also characteristics of the time is the general emphasis placed upon the inspiring femininity of both queens. British colonization, Marie Trevelyan pointed out, was the task of families, not soldiers, just as it was the woman, Boadicea, who rallied all the tribes of Britain round her in her day. Led by Queen Victoria, it was the woman of Great Britain who had materially helped to spread and maintain the British Empire. Hang on. Okay, let's see if I can get a little further. As for Marie Trevelyan's Boadicea, even in war she never surrendered her natural tenderness. At the last battle, indeed, the majestic queen was described as being lost in the weeping woman. On the other hand, when Boadicea's men responded loudly to her speech with the rallying cry, "For Britain, Boadicea, and freedom," they were, of course, intent on making aggressive war rather than domestic peace. So, Boadicea, aided both by late Victorian perceptions concerning women and empire, and by the image of Queen Victoria herself, passed into the pantheon of idealized patriotic women. It is a place she has not lost in the odd 90 years since the erection of her statue, and is not likely to lose so long as national crises arise, demanding reference to comforting historic symbols of courage and endurance. Patriotic fervor helped make up one part of the modern Boadician plinth. At the same time as women stirred in their struggle for at the same time as women stirred in their struggle for general recognition as a sex, rather than as privileged individuals, Boadicea's Protean legend began to be employed in quite a different connection. Pageants had become increasingly popular in late Victorian and Edwardian times. In this manner, the British aristocracy was able to show off both its adequate historical knowledge and its more than adequate historical fancy dress in a pleasurable real-life example of zeugma. But the pageant of great women, first performed on the 10th of November 1909 at the Scala Theatre, London, was a pageant with a difference, since it was performed in the suffragette cause. This was 2 months after the Prime Minister Asquith had instructed the prison doctors to feed suffragette hunger strikers forcibly. Originally produced by the play department of the Actresses Franchise League, written by Cecily Hamilton, designed and directed by Edith Cragg, the pageant subsequently toured the country. Boadicea's A Britain in Arms was one of the most prominent characters. When she appeared, spectators were adjured to look on her who stood and spat defiance at the hosts of Rome. A photograph of the event in the Daily Mirror shows what they saw. A stalwart Boadicea, towering over her companions and got up more or less according to Dio Cassius' instructions, with flowing tresses over a barbaric robe, a torque and other jewels, and an enormous spear in her hand. Another possible comparison to Ellen Terry's famous portrait as Lady Macbeth reminds one that Edith Cragg was Ellen Terry's daughter. The character of Prejudice was played by a man. Otherwise, the familiar stage army, in this case literally so, of great women was paraded in categories which included learned women, artists, and saintly women, as well as rulers and warriors. Here, Queen Zenobia of the hero's heart was placed among the rulers, but the Rani of Jhansi, though but a child in years, found her place among the warriors together with Boadicea, Joan of Arc, and the 14th century Scot Agnes Dunbar. It was intended by this appeal to the rich past to draw public attention to the physical, intellectual, creative, and ethical strengths of women, in contrast to prejudice's contemptuous declaration that women's innate stupidity made her incapable of thought. 52 actresses took part. In order to facilitate touring, it was Edith Craig's plan that such a pageant should contain only 3 speaking parts, all allegorical. These were performed by professionals. Otherwise, members of suffragette societies on the spot would supply the colorful heroines, Edith Craig arriving to dress them. This ingenious arrangement was not without its little local difficulties. The extreme popularity of the role of Joan of Arc constituted one of them. Another of a rather different nature was encountered when the members of a suffrage society in a university town thought they knew enough for no one to be anxious to play Catherine the Great, who, whatever may have been her merits as a ruler, was renowned for the scandals of her private life. Finally, a girl was found who presumably shared Edith Craig's view that a good part was a good part for all that. The pageant ended with Prejudice taking his stand on force as the last and ultimate judge, and claiming that force, for man alone who takes the sword that must decide. Woman, on the other hand, declared Prejudice, fears the white glint of it and cowers away. It was at this point that the warriors, led by Boadicea, were paraded in rebuttal. The stage directions read, "Then Prejudice slinks away." But Prejudice, if he left the stage of the Scala Theatre, did not slink far, let alone slink away altogether, even with the winning of the vote for women at various dates in various countries across the world. 70 years after the pageant of great women, an extraordinary exhibition was shown in San Francisco for the first time, before embarking upon a worldwide tour to packed attendance. There were, for example, long queues in London when it was shown at a converted warehouse in White Lion Street, Islington, in the spring of 1986. The dinner party was conceived by the American artist and craftswoman Judy Chicago and executed by her over 5 years with a working community of women and men. The exhibition consisted of 39 place settings upon a large, open, triangular banqueting table, which in turn rested upon a porcelain heritage floor bearing the names of 999 women, grouped into categories. Its aim? An avowedly feminist one, was not only to symbolize the long history of female achievement, but also to remind its audience that the history of Western civilization as we have understood it has failed to represent the experience of half the human race. The dinner party's categories include primordial goddess and fertile goddess, but also Kali, a category described as a traditionally positive view of female power, misrepresented as a destructive force, such as Celtic Britain's Rhiannon. Boadicea's 1682 AD death is like Kali, the name which heads a category standing for the tradition of warrior queens extending back to legendary times. Other Boadicias, including Katimandu, Artemisia, Cleopatra, defined as a ruler deity, Medb of Connacht, Tomyris, and Zenobia, given the full panoply of description as queen, warrior, military strategist, and scholar. Give or take changes in the language of female protest between 1909 and 1979, there is an obvious and significant similarity between the suffragette pageant and the feminist exhibition in method of execution. It is not just that certain devaluations of the nature of women, her innate stupidity and cowardice, for example, as denounced by the pageant's male figure of prejudice, are clearly still perceived to need rebuttal in the late 20th century, as they have been rebutted by bold spirits throughout history. Further than that, the appeal in both cases to triumphant women of the past bears witness once again to the enduring importance of heroines such as Boadicea, mythical or actual, to women combating their own inferior status. And this, despite the passionate desire of many women to help forward all their sex, not merely the potential leaders. With the coming of the women's movement, such heroines naturally take on new guises. In The Dinner Party, for example, Elizabeth R., like Boadicea, constitutes a category. The first, Elizabeth, is described as one of the greatest female rulers who ever lived, distinguished stateswoman and scholar. While not dissenting from the verdict, one cannot help wondering what Elizabeth Triumphans herself would have made of the all-female company. She who was accustomed to pikes being couched and ensigns lowered in devotion as she passed, to she alone and none but only she. To say nothing of her calculated boast of having the heart and stomach of a man. Boadicea, on the other hand, has come to symbolize a kind of female freedom and even sexual liberation. The discovery by the feminist poet Judy Grahn to her own satisfaction, that the name Boadicea, in its original Boudica form, was the origin of the word bull dyke. May stand as an extreme example of this. Gran, in an article of 1980 entitled The Queens of Bull Dykery, described how in years past the mastery of the word bull dyke had burbled and thickened in her mind. Deciding that it stemmed from Old English, she therefore searched for historical people who once worshipped and valued bulls. From here to Boadicea, Bo means cow in Irish.